Everybody excited about the Air and Space Museum today? Yeah. But first, we're excited to tell you about how you can accelerate your analytics journey with applications. And if you don't work in healthcare, don't worry. We've got lots of good examples that will apply to you, especially on the visualization side. So you're going to be hearing from me, George Dealy. I'm the Vice President of the Healthcare Applications team. Gabrielle Amarosa. Gabrielle is one of the lead developers on the team. We also have Patrick and Josh, raise your hands, also from the team. And Colby Lutz, who is a longtime DI customer and senior BI consultant at UPMC-Western, Western Maryland. So I'm going to start off talking about the application strategy that we've taken. So that's kind of the why we did it. Gabrielle's next going to talk about how we go about doing it. And then finally, Colby is going to talk about how he and his team have extended our applications to meet the specific requirements of his organization. So let me start with a question. Have you ever tried to build a analytics decision support application absolutely from scratch? White sheet of paper, blank sheet of paper. Hands? We've heard about a couple of them today. Right? Well, if you did, you probably ran into a few challenges, right? So in addition to those challenges, you've got to start out with laying that basic foundation of data, relationships, business and clinical logic, measures, a lot there, right? And you need to do that before you even start working with your users. And then you've got the very quickly evolving set of requirements that leads to that seemingly unwinnable race to that first useful, meaningful deliverable. Forget about what Kathleen was talking about, minimal viable product. We're just talking about getting to the point where you can start working with users. And then as you start factoring in those requirements, complexity invariably creeps in, right? And then you've got the ongoing challenge of maintaining the application. You're never done, right? In order to keep the information fresh, you've got to continually refresh things like reference data. So granted, it's a lot to take on, right? Well, at Dimensional Insight, we've encountered all of those challenges working with our customers. And what we've realized is that if you want to reuse the code that you've already written to create applications, you need a very flexible architecture and a reusable approach to creating applications. So that's what we've done. We've created a system for doing that. And it's built on Diver platform, which I'm sure you'll agree, very powerful data engine with lots of functionality. And we've layered onto that Measure Factory. So Measure Factory brings an understanding of the kinds of capabilities that you need to build analytics applications. Things like measures and KPIs, data sets, complex logic, reference data, things like description lookups and value sets. And then we've also made DivePort Measure Factory aware so that it can take advantage of those analytical capabilities. And then My Library, which you've heard about today, that provides a consistent, unified user experience where applications have been deployed across multiple dive ports and dive lines. And it also provides users the flexibility to organize information in the way that's most convenient to them, individual users as well as teams. So we've used all of that technology to create a family of applications that solve a variety of business problems, clinical problems that our customers have told us are important. And that starts with some foundation applications like hospital operations and ambulatory. And those provide the basic foundation of data, measures, relationships. And on top of that, we build out a second layer that's focused on subject areas, things like service lines. So we've got surgery, emergency, critical care, finance, revenue cycle, and then outcomes. So we'll be talking about quality and outcomes, Gabrielle will. And then on top of that, we've got a third layer that integrates that data in a variety of different ways to solve different types of problems. So how do those things help you if you're a developer or administrator. First of all, you've got the structure, right? You don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to create all of that data foundation. Next, you've got complexity. So the applications approach helps insulate you from that complexity. And then quick deployment, so the ability to get information, meaningful information, into the hands of your users quickly. Now, if you're an information consumer, you've got accessibility, right? So you want to be able to get to information. And also, we've created the approach in such a way that it focuses on the needs of stakeholders, information consumers, and subject matter experts, so that they're actually direct participants in the process of creating applications. So we heard a couple of folks talk about actually helping to build the application, even though they're not developers. Then we've got extensibility. So the applications are really designed as a starting point. So where you have additional requirements, the idea is to extend the application. So that helps users start with a base application and then extend it in a way that's going to be helpful for them. And then, of course, there's ongoing relevance. So in a lot of cases, the reference data, transactional data is always changing, but reference data changes on like a periodic basis. So we actually provide refreshes to that reference data so you don't have to worry about it. So if you are an application user already, you're probably thinking that this is somewhat familiar. But if you're not, you're probably like, well, this is intriguing, but I'd like to know a little bit more detail. So what we're going to do next is look at a specific example of an application that we've built recently within the last year. And there's no better person to talk about that than Gabrielle, because she was the lead developer on the project.
Thank you, George. It's so nice to see all of you in person. Okay, so what we're going to do is walk through the process of what it's like for us at DI to design and develop and ultimately maintain an application. So we're going to walk through some of the essential questions that we ask ourselves to frame that process. And as we do that, I'm going to tie it back to our experience with Outcomes Advisor to make it a little more concrete for you to understand. First, to give a little bit of high-level context, as you saw in the product family visual that George shared, Outcomes Advisor is intended to sit on top of an existing hospital operations-based application, and it gives deeper insights into outcomes and quality measures. So think readmissions, mortality, excess days in acute care, as well as the various AHRQ measures. So with that context, the first question we ask ourselves are, which KPIs belong in this new application that we are designing? So at a high level, why was Outcomes Advisor a good candidate for us to build? Well, we've gotten a lot of feedback from customers that that information needs to be more accessible and understandable. So for example, every year hospitals get the CMS annual report with information about how they're performing on those various outcome measures. But they need a better way to understand, well, what's driving that number, and if I want to improve it or change it, where do I focus? So that's really the gap we were trying to fill. On a more technical level, there were a few reasons that this application was a good candidate for us in particular to work on. So there's pretty complex logic spanning various very dense technical specifications. I see Julie nodding. As well as extensive external data sets, or excuse me, value sets and reference data that need to be maintained on that ongoing basis. So there's a lot of upfront time and expertise investment needed to kind of get this off the ground, have it be usable, and validate it appropriately. Fortunately, the Diver platform and Measure Factory in particular are very well suited to some of those technical challenges, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So first, if any of you have ever looked at one of the CMS outcomes specification documents, they are very long. And this just shows kind of one snippet of a logic flow chart that walks you through determining whether a record is a planned or an unplanned visit. So we need to take this times a factor of many, and translate that into usable logic and then validate it. So one thing that Measure Factory offers that makes this convenient is to actually create the algorithm within a plugin so that it's a process that is called by a daily factory refresh and does not need to be maintained in some separate process. So that's how we really tackled and have maintained the algorithm itself. And all of these kind of decision points in this flowchart are supported by the value sets, which are also, as you may have guessed, quite extensive. So these can be hundreds to thousands of records. They are updated annually. So here you're seeing an example of the ICD-10 PCS codes, which are indicating whether something is a potentially planned procedure. So this data, as well as other data that's important for outcome measures, are maintained by a variety of organizations on different release schedules. So keeping that straight is a challenge in and of itself. But again, we have a process for that. So for those of you familiar with our Blueprint project, we already have a centralized way to bring in various value sets and reference data, make sure that there aren't conflicts, and then integrate it seamlessly into the factory project of our choice. In this case, that would be Outcomes Advisor. So starting from some pretty dense technical specifications, we're able, through that Measure Factory and DI technology, to really narrow down to an intuitive and actionable list of KPIs, and you can see a subset of what we included in this application here. Okay, so the second question that we think about is how do we create helpful context around those KPIs once we have them? So what we wanted to focus on for Outcomes Advisor was really flexible custom benchmarking. Now, the idea of using benchmarks and targets is not new for our applications. You've heard many examples today of where that's being used. In Outcomes Advisor, instead of hard-coding targets or having a set formula that calculates the targets or requiring that process to be more on the manual side, we actually entered into an agreement with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services and ResDAC to use the limited data sets to create extremely custom benchmarks. So let me walk you through an example of what that looks like. Okay, so on the left-hand side, let's say that I am Beverly Hospital, and what you see on the bottom half of the left-hand side of the screen are my average length of stay measures. So here I can see numerator, denominator, what the value is, how it compares to the national average, so on and so forth. On the right-hand side is where the magic happens. So the right-hand side is drawing on that CMS limited data set, and I can select, let's say I want to compare myself to a peer cohort of hospitals that are similar to me in some significant ways. So for example, I want to look at other medium community hospitals in the state of Massachusetts. And from that subset, I'm going to cherry pick a smaller list of hospitals that I've decided are similar to me based on some decision criteria, maybe case mix or something else. So what you see on the bottom half of the right screen, those average length of stay measures are actually based on that cohort that you just selected. So if you swapped out one of those hospitals, those numbers would change and that would be reflected. So if you are, you make your selection, you analyze this, and you say, okay, well, these are similar to me, and they're performing better on average length of stay, but I feel like that's an achievable goal. This is what I want to aim for. This is what I want my benchmark to be for average length of stay. You can click the select button, and that will be available after your next daily refresh. And tomorrow, you can go in and change it again if you decide that wasn't quite the right fit. So this is how we really focused on creating context for the KPIs. Our next question is to think about, okay, we've done all of that. How do we make sure it's actionable? So just to step back a little bit, those values that we selected for our peer cohort, everywhere on the screen that you see an expected value, an observed to expected ratio, that is all based on the custom peer cohort that we just selected. So, for example, if you look at the first discharge location, we see that our observed is 76.09. The expected 137.12, that would be based on the cohort that we just selected. Okay, so where we focused on making this actionable was actually highlighting where the opportunities to improve are. So on the far right-hand side of the bottom portlet, you see the opportunity in days, and we try to make that really clear with creative visualizations. Where does that opportunity exist? So what this allows us to do is if we change that dimension, we can look at any level of granularity available within the data. So I can look at specific providers or departments, and I can see who's comparing really well as compared to the cohort that we've selected for ourselves to benchmark against. And then I can go find out, well, what are they doing that's contributing to that great performance, and how do I bring that to other parts of the organization? So that's how we tried to make this actionable. Okay, so we've put a lot of effort into choosing our KPIs, creating helpful context, and making sure that the information is actionable. But if no one's accessing it, that's a lot of wasted effort. So making sure that this was accessible, to a variety of users is top of mind for us. So we focused on a few things here. First of all, we put a lot of effort into the logic and visualizations and outcomes advisor to make sure they really reflected our best practices. Of course, we have those integrate nicely with all of our existing Diver platform tools, as well as the new My Library. And we also thought of Outcomes Advisor in the sense that, as organizations are trying to build their custom applications, they could look back here for ideas about what dashboards could look like. How do you nicely integrate some of the visuals with the more numerical representations in a way that they're not all completely siloed. So we were trying to kill a few birds with one stone here. So I've shown you some of the more numerically heavy dashboards. So here's another example that's useful for a different subset of users. So here we're showing a map portlet where we're looking at the observed to expected ratio by zip code. So what's really useful about this is regardless of how technical or data savvy a user is, most people can look at this familiar landscape and quickly get a picture of what's going on here and kind of create a story around what they're seeing. And if you're someone who does want that deeper level of granularity, you could, this isn't live, but if I were to click on, for example, one of the zip codes that is colored red, I would get a pop-up where I could then dive into the data and see, well, what's causing that to be red? So we tried to think about making sure that there were pages that were going to be broadly applicable to all different types of users from all different types of backgrounds within the organization. And of course, this also integrates nicely with My Library to provide that consistent user experience. We don't have that barrier of needing to navigate things looking different in different places and not knowing where to go for answers, as well as to integrate it nicely with any custom content that an organization might choose to create. And finally, how do we make sure that these applications stay relevant over time? As George and I both touched on, a lot of the Outcomes Advisor specific value sets and reference data are updated annually by different organizations on slightly different timeframes, so we provide updates for that. In a broader sense, outside of just Outcomes Advisor, one thing we've become really focused on is the idea of master data management. So we've gotten useful feedback from customers that wherever it's possible to take reference data from a standardized source or organization, such as the examples pictured on the screen, that's preferable than trying to bring it through the source system where there may be conflicts or discrepancies, especially as you're changing source systems or adding new sources of data. So wherever it's possible to do that for reference data, we also do that for our other applications as well. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a little bit of insight into what it's like to think through building an application from the ground up and sparked some ideas for what you can do in your organization with this as well. And now I'm going to turn it over to Colby, who did just that.
Okay, so I'm going to take a step back from the dashboard oriented and talk a little bit more about the development and how to leverage what already exists within hospital operations to build on top of it, the same that they're doing with Outcomes Advisor. And at UPMC-Western Maryland, we had a need for what I determined was a lab advisor. And what this really came from is we lived in a 6X world and we've lived in the Measure Factory world. And let me tell you, Measure Factory is where you want to be. So when we had all these custom reports within the 6.4 environment and you had dashboards that were very static, to say the least, without a lot of additional development, there was just so much room for improvement on what could be done overall. So what I decided that I would do is I'm going to take what they've given me. I'm going to take my understanding of their development of hospital operations. I'm going to leverage those data sets, And then I'm just going to build measures on top of them with with a different data set that I'm going to pull in myself that I'm very familiar with from custom reporting, which is my lab data. So what you see up here is the measure dictionary for the initial portion of how I built the lab advisor. There were several key drivers to this. One of them mainly being COVID. They wanted to track the COVID testing. We wanted to see, I apologize, scrolling ahead. We wanted to see how many of our tests were going which directions, and in real time kind of track what our expectation for testing requirements and needs were. So that was the initial development of this. It was really COVID-based. And then where you see the turnaround time measures and the test measures come in was really just what those other custom reports were. So in terms of application design, it's definitely in its infancy for right now, and that's really because we're bringing in a new set of users to Dimensional Insight. Our lab users are not very familiar with the product just yet, so we're trying to take baby steps in, limit the number of measures, similar as you've heard in previous presentations. Putting in 50, 60 measures at a time is not useful to the end user. They get overwhelmed. They're trying to focus on the small pieces, take this in small bites, small chunks. So we've limited the number of dashboards and measures as we start. And what I've developed is we've developed turnaround times in relation to order to collect, collect to receive, receive to verify, and then resulted, verify to resulted. We've implemented provider test practicing so that we can identify and break down the provider order practices by test, by priority, by the percent of tests with non-normal results, average tests per patient, and so on, unnecessary tests, tests that resulted post-discharge, so therefore probably unnecessary to be ordered in general. Kind of inversely to that, we created the same kind of scorecard for tests themselves, where you can identify how many tests, how much of an individual test is being ordered, by whom, by the non-normal result, by priority, and so on and so forth. So it's two different ways to look at the same information, but it really kind of gets you the full holistic view of what you need. Beyond that, we implemented the self-service for the user. So as I continue to build on measures that are specifically asked for by certain departments, as we add micro and blood bank and pathology all in here, I wanted to make sure the self-service users were aware of what that was. So as the dashboards weren't ready yet and I built the measures, they could build their own or understand how that worked, so that we could kind of get them a leg up in the process of using this application. So a little bit in the back end, talking about the integrated data sets. For the first pass, we limited the integrated data sets to the account and diagnosis data sets that you're probably familiar with within hospital operations. And that decreased the time of deployment significantly, because these data sets had already been in use and validated. You could already leverage the work that you had done to bring these in. And as you can see up in the top right corner, the code is as simple as one line. Bring in your C-base input right there. So because these data sets had already been validated previously, what we found is the validation on the new data set was that much easier. Anytime that I found that an account didn't line up or I was getting missing information one way or another, it directly led me to ask the appropriate question to understand what's different about the lab data from the hospital analytics data. And what I normally found is either the account was deleted, it was a test account, just needed to be deleted for some reason in live. It was based on an environmental test, so I learned that they do environmental tests, not on patients, but they'll swab machines to find out cleanliness. They'll do other things. I had no idea, didn't know to ask that, but through this validation process, these things bubbled to the top. And then the last one would be an incorrect account, whereas I don't know how many of you are familiar with Meditech, but it's not very difficult to put something on an incorrect account. If you hit F9 and you're looking up an account, you pick the person's name. It could be an old account, and as you're going through your day, if you just had a long day, it's very easy to do that. So incorrect accounts bubble to the top as well. So your other image down here, I just wanted to show that really all you need to do is alias in, and I aliased in MF hospital data sets to access that C-base within the factory code that you're going to see up in the top right. So that allowed me to build the factory relatively quickly. I integrated my lab data set, my accounts data set, my diagnosis data set, and I built my measures. And then it came to, let's build the dashboard. And this is probably my weakest point in using the product itself, is I've always been a coder at heart, and I've got an IT background. So visualizing what the users want, unless they can tell me, fairly clearly, isn't my strongest point. So what I was able to do is just leverage the resources available to me through DIUX. They've got stamps, they've got icons, they've got dashboard design, all, pre-created, ready for you to steal the code and put it in and pretend like it's your own. So pre-built applications come with so many of these bells and whistles, like you were just seeing in Gabrielle's, that using this resource allowed me to give my lab advisor the same look and feel as the latest and greatest that you have to offer within your applications. So what this all comes down to is by leveraging the data sets that already existed and my existing knowledge of what created those custom reports, I was able to create a lab advisor in under 3 weeks. And a lot of that time was more or less validation, believe it or not, because these dates are overlapping. So creating the flags and extracts and your scripts, maybe 3 days tops. I needed to flag what the COVID tests were. I needed to flag whatever outliers were, put them in my blueprint scripts, and they were ready to go. Creating the factory minus the measures, at most 2 days. More or less, you saw that it's one line of code to bring in the old 2 data sets. You enter the new data set, and then you link up your data between them. So linking those up and identifying what dimensions are going to be useful for the users to access within the different data sets was probably the longest portion of that. So identifying and integrating the measures, you identify the measures through the custom reports and the lack thereof within the factory, as well as what's being asked of new. So in my case, it was the COVID measures. Dashboard creation, this was more, let me just create some stamps, right? Why put all this effort into it? Let me see what visualizations they like, and I'll put some stamps out there. And if they have a twist on what they want to do, well, I can either find a different stamp that does that, or I can create my own stamp that does that. But creating the indicator portlets and all your background portlets and all that, that's a way of the past that I'm just not going to go back to unless it's completely necessary. So yeah, then the validation and adjustments, getting this back in front of their face to say, hey, is this what you want? Is this actionable for you? Can you maintain, your process from your old reports, but with the depth of the data availability within one click? And then the reintegration into custom reporting. So, of course, with all these data sets, a factory is great, dashboards are great, an advisor product is great, but I find myself leveraging the new data set within other custom reports as necessary. So whenever you've got something that's going outside of the system that's, we report either in Maryland, we've got several different entities that we have to report to, but you can reintegrate that new data set into those outgoing messages is a priority as well. But this made it a quick one-day project of removing the old data set, adding the new one, and it's plug and play to go. So down there at the bottom is just a quick look at the production script. It mimics how you would see in hospital operations as well. But that's kind of the whole point, right? Leverage what you've seen, leverage what you know, and copy and paste. And everybody that spends enough time in here, I truly believe would be capable of doing the same. So.
Just a couple of closing thoughts. One is that the technology that we've used to create these applications is available to our customers. There's nothing that we've done that's somehow behind the wall that you can't get to. Secondly, what we've tried to do in the applications is to provide best practices templates, so you can literally pull up the hood, as Colby did, and understand how we did certain things. So when you get into complex logic, for example, when you need to do a plugin, you can see exactly how we did it. So those are there for you to use. You're not stealing it. Feel free to cut and paste.